Do memory cards actually fail? Let's use science to see if we can find out. Special thanks to my friend Chris Reddy, who put together a poll that we distributed. And first, let me talk a little bit about risk management. People suck at it. We're not good at assessing the true cost of things that might go wrong in our lives. In particular, this rate relates to memory card failures because I've gotten so many emails from people who had a problem, maybe a hard drive failed or a memory card failed, and suddenly they lost all their pictures, but they were just shaken and devastated. And this is one of those cases where some sort of failure in your life actually has a really big impact. It's not a minor impact. So even though it might not be likely to happen, the cost of it happening can be really severe. People also trust a sample size of one. So there are so many people out there who've never had a memory card fail, and they then extrapolate that the rest of the world will not have memory card failures. And many people have even thought, because I recently had a memory card failure and was public about it, they thought I must be doing something wrong. I must be lying about it because they've never had a memory card failure, and therefore nobody must have had a memory card failure. But it's just not true. You just can't trust a sample size of one. People also tend to believe that they control their own destiny. So we reject ideas that fate would just come in and mess with us like that. But the truth is, there's luck, right? Some of us are lucky and some of us are unlucky. If you want a full video explaining different ways to keep your business running, go to sdp.io/BC, like business continuity, because I already did a video that nobody watched about it. And it'll address questions like, hey, if you need 2 memory card slots, why don't you have 2 cameras? Like, yeah, you probably need 2 cameras too. So we did a poll. We had 4,344 people participate in it. To the best of my research, I think this is by far the largest poll that anybody has done. I did contact memory card manufacturers looking for their own statistics on failure rates, and they would not provide that information just because it's confidential for them. Let me say this polling data is not perfect. There are certainly, it was not a random sampling of people required to take the poll. People were able to opt in or opt out. A lot of people shared it, and they might have shared it saying, hey, this guy thinks memory cards fail all the time. You should fill it in and tell him that it hasn't. Or they might have said, hey, if you've had a memory card fail, take this poll. I don't know how everybody might have shared it, but I will say it's not nothing. And we had certain controls in the data that, to me, when I examined them, show that the data is meaningful and statistically significant. So let's get into it. Over the course of photographers' lives, 47% have experienced a memory card failure and 53% have not. This is the number of photographers who've experienced a failure. It's not the number of memory cards that have experienced a failure. I kind of don't have a good way to gauge that. So I just ask people their own experience. This is directly related to how many pictures people have taken. If you've taken under 10,000 pictures, then about 35% of those people, 36% of those people have had a failure. So most people with less than 10,000 pictures have not had a failure. The biggest group is in the 10,000 to 100,000 group, and 42% of those people had a failure. And you can see this continues to increase until we get to the point where people who've taken over 1 million photos, more than 3 out of 4 of them have had a failure at some time in their career. And because this is such a nice, clean line, we can draw the conclusion that the more pictures you take, the more likely you are to have a failure. This, to me, means the data is kind of meaningful because that also passes a sanity check, right? Like, this is the way you would expect the data to look. So there are people who say they've been shooting for 30 years and they've never had a failure. And first, I would say, even SD cards haven't even been around for 20 years. So it was a weird thing to say. This is a direct quote. But if you've been shooting for a long time and haven't had a failure, it just means you're up here. Like, there's still almost a quarter of people with more than 1 million shots who've never had a failure. Some people are just lucky. You're just lucky. But that doesn't mean that everybody is so lucky. And in fact, most people are not. Let me take a moment and plug my stuff. Check out our store, northrop.photo. Buying this stuff is what makes all this research possible. Stunning digital photography will improve your photos. Photoshop and Lightroom books for post-processing, and the art and science of photography is great for people who want to take their photography to the next level. 20% coupon code FAIL20. Okay, so more data. Number of people who have 2 card slots on one or more of their cameras versus 1 card slot. 53% of people have at least 1 camera with 2 card slots. 46% of people only have cameras with 1 card slot. So a lot of people are okay with using 1 card slot, but given that most people will see a failure of their memory cards and almost half of them are using cameras without sort of data redundancy at the memory card level, we can see that there's going to be a lot of people losing data. I'll give you a tip on how to recover that data if disaster does strike you. Let's talk about whether different form factors fail more than others. For example, do SD cards fail more than XQD cards? The answer seems to be yes. Based on the number of people who reported that they owned these cards versus which cards that they failed, that they had failed, the most likely to fail were the old Sony memory sticks, which aren't really around anymore, and I will testify were a piece of crap. The next most likely to fail were micro SD cards, which are small and flimsy and super easy to lose, but also probably easy to crack and break. SD cards were the next most likely to fail. CF cards were a little less likely to fail, followed by XD cards. The least likely to fail, in fact, were CFast and XQD cards. Now, if you add these numbers up, they will not match the numbers from the previous slides. That is because the way our poll was structured, some people would report that they had, say, an XQD card and that they had a failure, but they would not report that it was the XQD card that failed. They might have had 4 different form factors and they didn't fill out that part of the form. So these numbers do not perfectly add up. But nonetheless, I do think the trends here are meaningful because we had a big pool of data. So why would it be that CFast or XQD cards might fail less often? Well, the first is that the most likely is that they simply have not been around for as long. SD cards, the standard came about in 1999, so they've been around for almost 20 years, and that means there's been lots of people using them, lots of chances for them to fail. XQD cards, for example, have only been popular for a couple of years. Therefore, there are going to be far fewer people who've had those failures, even if they had the same rate of failure, since things tend to fail over time, right? To try to offset that, I simply divided those previous numbers by the number of years that the cards have been for sale. And you can see a much flatter line here. The number of failures between XQD and CFast versus SD cards is much closer than it was on the previous slide that didn't factor in the lifespan of these cards. Nonetheless, it still seems like CFast and XQD cards are indeed more reliable form factors. Another reason for that might be that the physical design is simply better. SD cards are plasticky and flimsy, and they have that little locking mechanism on them, which can totally flake out. The CFast and XQD cards are much sturdier. If you don't use a case and throw them in your bag or something, they're much less likely to bend or crack. That could be part of it. SD cards are heavily counterfeited. Because they are so popular, it makes sense for, say, companies in China to pass off a nice SanDisk or Lexar card as some generic, use generic internals and just stick a different sticker on there. So they're using really cheap or crappy cards or cards that are not the full capacity that they state they are. This happens a lot, and people wouldn't know that they were fake necessarily, but they'll still get reported as a failure. The final reason I came up with that professional cards like XQD cards might fail less is that they have professional users. It could be only pro photographers are probably using XQD cards, and they might know to take care of their cards a little bit better. Here is a breakdown of the types of photos that people have lost. First of all, about 54% of people have never lost photos. Of the remainder, let's say about 40% of people lost personal photos, and about 9% of people lost business photos. So we still have 9% of people reporting that they lost pictures taken for a business client. That's a really big deal. If you can imagine being a wedding photographer and having to tell the bride, oh, I didn't get pictures of you kissing the groom because of a memory card failure, that can be a really big deal. But these personal losses can be really devastating too. If it's pictures of your newborn baby or some memory that you'll never get back, a wonderful vacation. I've had so many people tell me stories where they took the trip of a lifetime and they get back and their card is unreadable, and that can be really devastating for people. Here's a quick overview of the reported market share for different memory cards. We had SanDisk reporting in at 47.7% of the cards that people owned, followed by Lexar, Samsung, Sony, Transcend, and PNY. I factored the percentage of people reporting these cards and compared it to the number of failures that they reported, because people would say, oh, my Transcend card failed or my SanDisk card failed. And again, this is incomplete data. These numbers will not add up because some people said they had a card fail, but they didn't report on the brand of the card failed. So I'm only including the numbers of people that included the brands of the cards that failed. But you can definitely see a trend here. about the same percentage of people who owned SanDisk and Lexar cards reported that they failed. So because I had a Lexar card fail, I had a lot of people telling me Lexar cards are unreliable, and that's part of why we included this. And it turns out Lexar cards do seem to be less reliable than Samsung or Sony cards, but they're not that far out of whack. They're about the same reliability as SanDisk cards, and in fact, they seem to be more reliable than Transcend cards, which noticeably fail more often than the other cards seem to. And by the way, so many cards are counterfeited that it's impossible for me to say like you're safer if you get a Sony card, because I actually don't know. I also happen to know that a lot of manufacturers will simply white label their cards. They'll take the same cards from some manufacturer and just stick their own labels on them. So the exact same internals might be on a Samsung, Lexar, SanDisk card. I don't know. They change these internals all the time. Some best practices for not losing data, because it really can be so devastating to people. One is get a camera with 2 card slots and use both card slots. I talked to a lot of people who have 2 card slots in their camera and they do not write data to both of them. You should do that, especially if you already have the camera. It's not going to cost you anything, right? You can even write RAW files to the faster card and JPEG files to the slower card. It's not a perfect backup, but if your main card fails, it's a whole lot better than nothing. If you buy new cards, you test the card out, because many cards are counterfeit. They might not have the full capacity. For example, you can buy a 128 gig card. It'll actually be a 64 gig card, but it reports to your operating system that it's 128 gigs. It literally lies. And then when you go to write the 65th gig, it will simply overwrite your data. So it won't even report an error. You won't know until you actually go back and read the data from the card that it's lying to you. And even then, you might not notice that a bunch of pictures are missing. So anytime you buy a new card, you should test it out. One such tool you can find at stp.io/testcard. It's a free tool. We have no association with them. It's just one that I happen to use. If you have a card fail or files get corrupted, dispose of that card. Do not continue to use it. We actually have a bin labeled failures, where we just have a bunch of cards where we've stashed them in there, because it does happen. I'll say personally, we have a lot of experience with SD cards because we probably buy 50 a month, because we sell SD cards as part of our books and art and science bundle for people who want offline video. So we're constantly buying and testing cards, and some percentage of cards fail. It's just we have a big base of experience with that. If you do have a failure, here's a tool that can help you recover data at stp.io/photorec. In particular, if you're a Windows user, go to this page, but look for the QPhotorec tool, which provides a nice graphical user interface. This is a pain. It can take, I've had it take more than 24 hours to try to recover data from a card. And even then it's hit or miss. You might not be able to get the data back. You might be able to get the data back. The file names are generally garbled. So if you're looking for a particular file that was corrupted, it's going to be kind of impossible. You'll be pulling up images that you took years ago on that particular card. But nonetheless, it might be better than nothing for you. Why are so many people mad about this SD card thing all of a sudden? I mean, it's always been the case that pro-grade cameras had 2 memory card slots, while consumer-grade cameras had 1 memory card slot, and it was because when you spent that much money, generally you didn't want to have to put all the important pictures on a single card without any sort of redundancy. But recently, Canon and Nikon both announced new full-frame mirrorless camera lineups with professional level pricing. Like the Nikon Z7 is priced at $3,400, and their cameras had 1 card slot. So we were a bit shook that they would price a camera at the same price, more expensive than a Nikon D850, which has 2 card slots, way more expensive than a D750, which has 2 card slots, and they would only give it 1 card slot, because we have had failures in the past, and we thought, as a habit, we don't recommend cameras with 1 card slots for professional use or even serious personal use. So we were shook about it, but people are really attached to their brands. People were really excited for these new cameras. They wanted to buy them. And anytime you deliver bad news like that, people end up shooting the messenger in a way. So I am totally fine if you want to take the risk of using 1 card slot. That's always been our position. It is just a calculated risk on your part. But people don't like to hear bad news. So they came back and they often said, no, hey, cards don't fail. I've never had a failure. If you had a card failure, it's all your fault. And so that's kind of what spurred us to do all this. And I think it's silly to get emotional about it, like use the camera or don't use the camera. Either way, it's fine by me. I just want you to be aware of the risks that you're taking and to plead to manufacturers. Let's end the era of memory cards. Okay? Back in the old days, we used film, and that was a real risk because I know I personally sent rolls of film through the processor and I'd get them back from the developer and they'd have scratches on them because something went wrong with their machine. And then that whole roll would be ruined. Or you might mail them in and the package just gets lost. There was lots of risks with shooting film and you didn't really have the option of redundancy. Then in the digital era, we were always writing to memory cards and first we didn't have redundancy and stuff failed and that sucked, but then we had redundancy and we we're taking advantage of it. But it's time to move beyond that. We need to first, I suggest the first step would be to put internal memory in these cards, like 128 gigs, 256 gigs of internal memory, just like you have in your smartphone. This internal memory is probably going to be much more stable because it can be hardwired in and it's not being removed and taken out, and you're not worried about cross compatibility. Like you control every component of it since it's integrated into the circuit boards of your camera. Internal memory and a memory card. And the internal memory can just be a continuous looping backup of the last number of pictures and video that people have taken. If they don't have a memory card in there, then they could just record to the internal memory and offload it via a USB. So this sort of automatic backup internal memory would be huge. It means you don't have to really take up any extra space inside the camera because you don't need to add that extra slot. The risk of it failing is going to be much lower than a traditional card. And then after that, after people get into a workflow that doesn't depend on taking the SD card out and putting it into the computer, then maybe 2 or 3 generations from now, we can start to phase out memory cards completely and be done with this era of failures. In the comments down below, I'd love to hear your own experiences. Why do you think this is absolute crap? I know some people are still going to be mad and they're still going to try to stick to the line that memory cards don't fail because they've never had a problem. So just have at it. Say your piece down below. If you want to actually learn photography, check out my book, Stunning Digital Photography, with more than 14 hours of video training included free. We have books on Photoshop and Lightroom, of the photography buying guide, which covers all sorts of camera gear stuff, things like studio lighting, what bokeh is and how much it might mean to you. And of course, the art and science of photography, which goes a level deeper than we do into YouTube with 10 hours of video. Go to northrop.photo and use the coupon code FAIL20 to get 20% off. And of course, subscribe for more free videos. Thanks.